Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing? Let me see. Do I have... Okay, so I'm finally using OBS software, and it seems to be working. I hope it's not freezing too much. So as I'm streaming. So here we go. Okay, so check my volume. Yeah, my volume's pretty loud. Yep. Checking one other thing. Okay, so yeah, I'm live. And let me check my audio. Wait. Okay, so I'm just going to try and share this out, but let's see. If you folks could share it out, that'd be great. I can try and do it right now. Let's see. So the topic tonight, I'm going to get sort of a deep dive into political philosophy and progressivism in the 21st century as I see it. Let me try and share this out, and if you share it out too, that'd be great. Sorry, taking a few more minutes, see if other people join while I share this out. Okay, so I think in the past I've talked about the state of progressivism as I see it in the US in the 21st century. And we're still in the first quarter of the 21st century. Things are pretty active. We had our first African American president of the US ever, Barack Obama, who was not a progressive. He was pretty much a corporate moderate. Some could probably rightfully claim that he was center-right. And now we have a corporate fascist, Donald Trump, as the next president. So I wanted to discuss a little bit tonight about political philosophies, and two terms I think are heavily under the surface when we discuss American politics in the 21st century. And those two terms are liberation and fascism, which are diametrically opposed to each other. And I'm not going to simplify it completely to the point that all progressives are for liberation and all, conservatives, reactionaries are complete fascists. It often falls somewhere along those lines, but I'm not going to make it quite that simplistic. Basically, as you've seen with some of my earlier videos, there's some problems within the progressive movement coming out of Bernie Sanders' campaign, and younger folks, not only younger folks, but younger folks and other people that don't have a lot of experience with politics, and certainly not political philosophies, that were very attracted by Bernie's personality, Bernie Sanders' personality, and many of his policies, if not all of his policies. I've liked Bernie Sanders since when I first knew about him in the early to mid 90s. He voted against the first Iraq invasion, and fought and voted against the second Iraq invasion back in the 90s when I was interning for Senator Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, who also voted against the invasion and occupation of both of those disastrous wars upon the people of Iraq. And so really there's folks that follow Bernie Sanders that aren't necessarily completely progressive. And they maybe like a few of Bernie Sanders' issues, but they're not truly critical of capitalism, and they're not truly critical of American exceptionalism, which is a form of nationalism, which is our country's form of nationalism. So basically, nationalism is a pathway drug, you could call it, to fascism. And liberation, basically, liberation of all peoples will lead you basically against nationalism, a sort of anti-nationalism, which I ascribe to. I happen to be a citizen of the United States. I happen to live here because my family lives here, and I have responsibilities largely to my family, and that's why I remain in the U.S. But I don't consider myself first and foremost a U.S. citizen. That's not like key to my identity at all. In fact, I think that nation states throughout history have caused more problems than they're worth. Even more so in modern times. And in modern times, with the full explosion, accumulation of the Age of Reason and different liberation movements, particularly in the 20th century, we as a people, human beings, have needed strong centralized governments less and less. So let me get these two terms up. And basically what I'm saying, what I just said was that that strong centralized governments have a great potential for evil and for controlling huge masses of people. And the elites of those governmental systems, it's in their interest to hold on to that power by dividing the masses, pitting one group within the masses against another group. So in today's political world, you see a lot of racial dog whistling, sexist dog whistling, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic dog whistling used, if not outright anti-homophobic and anti-trans words being used in political conversations and debates and statements that these conservative politicians are making, to, again, divide the masses, distract them from the real struggles, which are struggles for liberation, for greater workers' rights, and so forth. And so I'll go into all of that a little bit more, but first let me get these two terms up on the board here, and I'm looking to see if it shows up, because this is like my first time using OBS, so I'm kind of like want to see that this is working here. First is fascism. Let's see if that came up. No, that didn't come up. Maybe if I do that and then do that. Did that come up? Let's see. So the first one is there. I see it. The definition of fascism. And let me read that to you. I'm trying to layer it, but it doesn't seem to want to layer. So I need to learn OBS a little bit more. Definition of fascism. 1. Often capitalized. A political philosophy, movement, or regime, such as that of the fascisti, that exalts nation and often race above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. 2. A tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial role. Early instances of army fascism and brutality. So there, you have the Merriam-Webster definition of fascism, and we'll go to the Merriam-Webster definition of liberation, or to liberate, basically. Because you go to the definition of liberation, it says the act of liberating or to liberate. So here is the definition for that. Transitive verb, to set at liberty, free, specifically to free something such as a country from domination by a foreign power. 2, to free from combination, liberate the gas by adding acid. 3, to take or take over illegally or unjustly. Material liberated from a nearby construction site. So basically, I don't think I'm really talking about 3 very much. Well, to a degree I am. In a liberation movement, often what is termed as illegal is really just a reaction against immoral, laws that are seen as immoral or a crime against humanity, even though they may be laws that set out in law codes approved by legislations and so forth. For example, the Jim Crow laws we used to have down south. Well, in many parts of this country, really, but particularly in the South, when people think of the 1950s and 1960s and the resistance work to overturn and abolish Jim Crow laws, which were specifically discriminatory laws against a group of people. If you remember, the definition of fascism talks a lot about that. So basically, you have fascism on one end of the political philosophy spectrum and liberation at the other end of the political philosophy spectrum. So really, folks that like to think of themselves as progressive, I would challenge them to think outside the box about these notions. And that really, people always say, well, Trump is a fascist. He's, proto-fascist. He's bringing fascism to the U.S. as fashionable or acceptable in polite company. But really, there's more to the roots of fascism in the U.S. than Donald Trump alone. So I challenge my fellow progressives or radicals to consider that further, and that the long history of slavery and genocide that was in this country for hundreds of years, you know, against African Americans and the native indigenous folks here, respectively, to think of those roots of fascism. And that the struggles, the civil rights struggle, the women's rights movement, the suffragette movement, the immigrant rights movement, some of which is going on now, the migrant workers' struggles from that in the late 60s throughout the 70s into the early 80s as liberation movements. And that really, if you're just thinking about, like, if you're pro Bernie Sanders, but you're not really on board with all that, then think about, you know, what are the policies that you're in favor of for Bernie, that Bernie Sanders advocates for. Single payer, Medicare for all. Well, that's maybe because you're going to benefit from it. But really, liberation also has to do with looking out for the interests of the community as a whole. And when you're looking at a community as a whole, it means all the people living within a community. And in the 21st century America, we're becoming more and more diverse. And that's a wonderful, beautiful thing. As a progressive, you should think that. If you don't, then you're not so progressive and you're not big in liberation. You're probably somewhere more towards fascism if you want a white ethno-state, even if you want, like, my neighborhood to be completely all white. You're not a progressive at all. I don't care if you like Bernie Sanders and put his bumper sticker on his car. If you're all about discriminating against people and trying to keep them out of your neighborhood, then you're not at all progressive at all. If you think that people should not be earning the same money for the same job or position, then there's something wrong there. You're not really a progressive. You don't think women deserve to make $1 to every man's $1, not 70 or 75 cents to a man's dollar. If you're not for that total equality in the workplace, then you're not so much a progressive. And to think even beyond that into larger issues of liberation. Liberation, like I was saying, is more about making sure the whole community is liberated, is free to do what it wants to do, to live where it wants to go to the schools that it wants to, that's what liberation is about freeing people, freeing others within your own community, because you see that as wrapped up in your own liberation, to become more free and more expressive, and to have freedom of association and freedom of assembly, and to travel wherever you may wish. And latest news came out this evening that there Latino Americans that are crossing across the border, that they're U.S. citizens, but they happen to be Latino, that are not having their passports renewed when they should by the government. The government's refusing to renew passports for Latin American U.S. citizens, Latin Americans that became U.S. citizens, and now they're being stopped at the border. Again, this is obviously an expression of fascism. So really, once you ignore the struggles and the plights of others within your community, whether your community be a town, a county, a state, or the whole country, you're ignoring part of your own liberation, because your liberation is tied up with others that you work with, you go to school with, you do business with, you trade you farm with, you have friendships, relations, your friends' friends, your friends' relatives, the people you see on the street, the people you interact with. If you're not advocating for their liberation, you're hurting your own liberation, because you're denigrating your own quality of life at that point. I strongly believe that. And if you're, advocating for the destruction of other people, you're a fascist. If you're constantly othering people because they're not white, they're not upper middle class or middle class. They're not going to college like you did. You're othering them, seeing them as somehow lesser valuable citizens of the society. You're a fascist. So it's just some things to throw out there for people to think about when they call themselves a progressive or a radical. You know, are you advocating for the status quo, or are you advocating for positive, significant changes in our society? Just things to think about. Yeah, I'm going to sort of branch off from this discussion in future live streams. And, you know, oh, I did have some notes. Let me see. This has to do with, like, political dialogue and how words are often twisted in American political dialogue of today. Yeah, I'm going to basically list here, like, words that I consider liberation words and how they are often twisted by politicians and even sometimes the corporate mainstream media. Now, the word freedom is thrown about a lot in political discourse and speeches, and even by the mainstream media. Freedom. He was a warrior for freedom. John McCain was this paragon servant or warrior of freedom. Well, freedom, you know, it's often used to really convey, like, patriotism, and patriotism is really an expression of nationalism. And we know what, you know, stronger or more extreme forms of nationalism are: Nazism, fascism. Now, libertarianism is often thought of with this great, like, the Libertarian Party, but more than that, just the economic and political philosophy of libertarianism is like freedom, people's personal liberty. But really, what they're getting at when they throw around libertarianism and what it really stands for is strengthening capitalism, holding on to capitalism, and greed, really, the human emotion or drive of greed, of always acquiring more. Like, this libertarianism, a lot of libertarians are all about, like, my acquisition of my wealth. Hands off, hands off, hands off. I'm not going to share with the community. Fuck you. So libertarianism, you're really talking about, like, capitalism and greed. Personal liberty. Now, personal liberty is often discussed, and really that can be seen as selfishness and being anti-community. Now, words that are liberation words but have been slandered and thrown in the mud, and people don't fully even understand them, except that they're some big bad boogeyman, even though they've never really studied up on them, is communism and socialism. People see that as, like, the direct gateway to authoritarianism, which is fascism, actually. And actually, communism and socialism is about actually freeing people, freeing communities to be happier in their lives, to have more well-rounded lives where the basic needs of humanity are met. Maslow's laws, and I'll go into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and in future videos I can discuss Maslow's hierarchy of needs a little bit more. But, like, communism and socialism is about meeting the needs of people, and so they can have more well-rounded, happier lives. But it's often thrown about, and people don't even understand what they're attacking, but it's this big bad boogeyman that leads directly to authoritarianism, which is fascism, which is actually opposite. Fascism is actually the opposite of, pretty much, of communism, socialism. People cite Stalin, and Stalin is a complete bastardization of communism, and he was, in fact, an authoritarian that murdered large groups of people. So he's a bastardization of communism. He is ultimately an authoritarian. And then I also made some notes to talk about the steps towards fascism, and I can do that in a future live stream. But like I mentioned before, extreme nationalism is one. the pathway of neoliberalism, where you begin to privatize everything, and everybody's about making a profit and charging people more money to do this and that, and so you're taking away the public sphere and gradually privatizing everything. And in fact, government and government contractors taking over parts of our government now is this whole pathway of neoliberalism that has been pursued basically since the mid to late 1970s. I would say maybe the late 70s it really took hold, and Reagan and Thatcher fully implemented it and embraced neoliberalism. And the last, these are different types of steps towards fascism. And the third and last one I wrote down was corporatism, which is related to neoliberalism, I guess. But I'll start with Mussolini, who was a fascist. He was a corporatist. And what do we have today? We have Donald Trump, who is also a corporatist. And it's basically about the government should be protecting corporations and not protecting individuals and communities anymore. And really it's, they're trying to twist government into serving corporations. And so profit over people. And so that is definitely a step towards fascism, where liberation would be people over profit. So I'm going to stop right there, and I'll have other more in-depth live streams about political philosophies and so forth, discussing my own political philosophy. I'm going to go into quite a bit, but I'll also be covering different protest actions and liberation struggles happening now in future videos as well. So thank you for joining me. This is Pete signing off.